All right, good evening, everybody. Hopefully, you've had a good week. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the fate of lactate, or our lactic acid cycle, the Cori cycle, OBLA, which is the onset of blood lactate accumulation. So, with that, let's go ahead and get started in. First thing I'm going to talk about here tonight is going to be our Cori cycle, or what is also known as the lactic acid cycle. So as you can see here, we have in our liver is where this will occur. But it also occurs in the skeletal muscle. So between these two systems, what we have is we have glycolysis breaking down lactate and making getting some glucose, and then taking that lactate, transporting it through our blood back into our liver through the venous system, and then once it gets back into the liver, it goes into gluconeogenesis and produces new glucose, which then gives us more energy, and then that is transported back through our blood back to the skeletal muscle. So the next slide that I'm going to show you here actually explains that a little bit better. So we have, if you remember, we have glycogen stored either in our skeletal muscle or we have it stored in our liver. So sorry about that, I'm just getting over a cold. So with that, as we know, our greatest store of glycogen has always been in the liver. However, our skeletal muscle also does still store glycogen as a way of being able to have a little bit of energy reserve built up into the system. So what happens, what we're going to be looking at here is this blood lactate area. Is this blood lactate area where you see the lactate, and then just imagine the venous system as it goes through back into your liver. When it enters your liver, it goes through gluconeogenesis to give us glucose, and then that glucose is then transported back through our arteries, our arterioles, and then taken into the skeletal muscle and deposited to give our mitochondria that needed amount of energy. So what we're talking about here, though, is with the lactate is how is this made? You know, when you think about it, when you're out doing a sport and you're pushing yourself pretty hard, and all of a sudden you're like, oh man, I'm feeling tired. This is getting rough. This is getting rough. Well, you're building up lactate in your system, or even lactic acid. So with these levels that are rising up, they're rising, as you can, I know this is a horrible demonstration with just my hands, but so you have these lactic acid buildup, and the lactate finally starts to take over, and it's raising, it's like, all right, so we get that dump from the glycogen, which then is produced through with the lactic acid that's sent through chemoreceptors to our brain to say, hey, guess what? We're going to need oxygen, or we're going to shut down, and you're not going to be able to finish this race. So once that happens, then we decide, oh, okay, well, let's get going. And that's when the glycogen dump comes. Once that glycogen dump comes in, then we decide, okay, we're going to have a little bit of energy so we can produce that lactate to go through our venous system back into the liver. And then, like I said, once it gets into that liver, it goes into gluconeogenesis and produces the glucose that's needed to help kind of further that. So, how does this occur? Well, it's going to be anaerobic to begin with, because your body is not able to produce that kind of that ventilatory threshold that we have. So what's happening is your ventilatory threshold's going up at a steady rate, and right below that is your blood lactate is kind of going at a steady rate, and then all of a sudden it's like, hey, guess what? I'm going to skyrocket and just shoot on up. So you have both of these going. I'm going to try to do this here. So they're, and then boom, here this goes. This is trying to catch up. This is trying to catch up, and finally they do catch up, but it's going to be a while, and I'll get to that in the next slide. But so it's an anaerobic process is basically what I want to tell you. is that you have a lack of oxygen at the cellular level. Not a lack of oxygen through the pulmonary function, but a lack of oxygen at the cellular level, because your body is not being able to produce that kind of oxygen and get it stored in the cells, in the mitochondria, to get that engine running. So that's where the onset of blood lactate accumulation, or OBLA, comes into. With OBLA, what we're looking at is basically that steady rate exercise, just chugging along, chugging along, chugging along, and then all of a sudden it's like, hey, guess what? We have enough lactic acid and we need to start raising up. So instead of just going to kind of, we're going to just, it just decides to shoot straight up, basically like a rocket ship. So then you have your lactic threshold, which is just a small little threshold to say, okay, we're able to do this, but we're going to start needing some oxygen. And that's where your ventilatory system is trying to catch up and say, hey, guess what? You either need to start giving us more oxygen or more glucose, or we're going to shut down on you. Now, there are 4 different ways that the lactate threshold can result. These are still under study, but the first one would be an imbalance in the rate of your glycolysis with the mitochondrial respirations. Basically, what I'm saying is there's too much diesel and not enough gasoline, if you want to think about it that way. So you're able to produce that diesel fuel with the glycolysis, and you're able to get that glucose, but you don't have enough gasoline in your system in order for that mitochondrial engine to produce the respirations that are needed. Now, or it can be a decrease in the redox potential. Remember our NADH friend from ATP lecture? So NADH and also our NAD ion, there's just a decrease in that amount. Or it could be that our blood has too low of an oxygen content. It could just be, somebody who's a smoker could be doing this and they have a decreased level of oxygen in their bloods already. So we're taking that blood oxygen level and decreasing it even more. Or finally, it could be that you've actually got a lower blood flow to your skeletal muscle. And that means that basically your body is shunting the blood away from your skeletal muscle towards your core. So in other words, it's like, hey, your fingers are going to start feeling a little different, or your arm might start feeling a little different because I need to bring this back to the core. That's completely separate from what we're discussing here, but that's also a lactate threshold, because now we're looking at how does that system going to function and supply energy to our body if it's shunting the blood away. The other one, as I discussed, OBLA occurs when the ventilatory threshold is just right before respiratory compromise. But again, this is at a cellular level. Don't think of this as being at as a pulmonary level. This is not something that you are going to see in a regular person. It is definitely at the cellular level. So here's a good graph of OBLA. Let me see if I can actually move my face out of here. Here we go. Okay, so here we have, this is our blood lactate, and this is through steady rate exercise. We're able to get about 1 millimole per liter, and then all of a sudden we hit this point of OBLA at 4 millimoles per milliliter. So that's when we've definitely increased. You can see this jump here. We've jumped from like 1.5 millimoles to 2, and our oxygen started off at about 1 liter per minute, about 1.25, 1.5, 2, and then all of a sudden we hit this 1.5 liter or millimoles per liter of lactate, and about 2.5 to 3 liters per minute of oxygen. And it's like, okay, so we're not getting enough oxygen to produce. So here goes that lactate way up, as you can see, and then we're trying to get that ventilatory threshold in here where our body's like, okay, I can produce this. And then we're just building up lactic acid and sodium. I'm sorry, I can't even pronounce the word. It's been a rough night for me. Anyway, we get into where this respiratory compensation is at, and then once we get into that um, respiratory compensation, that's when we actually start to physically see this. You know, we're trying to get extra oxygen in our blood. We're hyperventilating in our system. And finally, if you notice up here, if these were to continue on, probably around the 12 millimoles per liter and about 4 to 4.5 liters per minute of oxygen, we're finally getting that consumption to come back. So, what do we think about this from a training adaptation? There's a couple of different important factors that we need to think about when it comes to VO2. The first one would be our maximal volume of oxygen uptake, or VO2 max, our maximum consumption of oxygen, or our steady rate of exercise, as you saw on that last slide. In this picture here, you can see these are runners from a Spartan race. It's an endurance style race. If you notice this guy in the background here, he's kind of lagging blind. He's probably got some good obla going on in this picture. This guy, he's got a little bit of a grimace on his face, so he's probably feeling like his muscles are starting to wear down on him. She looks like she's doing pretty good. She's got a pretty good form of running there. So she might have a better steady rate exercise increase. But basically, what we need to look at for training adaptations are, does the person have any kind of respiratory compromise? Is there anything that can be seen to where they aren't able to function as well to produce oxygen at the cellular level? Is there some kind of block that they have? Could it be such a thing as emphysema or asthma, or that they have some kind of that they just haven't properly trained? One of the things that you could do for training would be to do high intensity interval exercise, because that's a good way to train short amount of time, but at the same time you're also increasing your aerobic capacity, because you're not letting yourself rest as much, so your body is building up a better oxygen and aerobic capacity to perform when you're doing an endurance race. Other than that, it's just a matter of looking at different adaptations as to could there be there's some research that there might be a racial difference. That's to be seen later at this time. Or is it just the way that we run? Is it a steady, you breathe in, you breathe out, but instead of you're like, so you're getting that better tidal volume of oxygen, but you're also getting good residual lung volume as well. Anyway, I hope that this has been helpful to you guys. As always, I hate to say that as always, because that's actually the way my instructor talks, and I respect him, but I'm not trying to emulate him. But if you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Here's a couple of the resources that I looked at. Have a good night, and I look forward to seeing you next time.